traditionally, the law has addressed the public space and the private space. And when I say space, I literally mean space. I don't mean intellectual space, I mean physical space. This home in which I live, it's a private space. Whereas if I were to walk down the street, it's a public street. This sharp distinction has been maintained in the law. There was a time when people used to say the law has no role to play in your home. Now, that concept is broken the moment you have a law which regulates what's going on inside that space. And what this act does is it defines what is domestic violence. Traditionally, we tend to think of violence as just physical violence. So, if a husband raises his hand on a woman, you and I would have no difficulty saying this is violence. But then violence is manifested in very different ways. The word domestic violence in the Act has been defined to include physical, emotional, psychological, sexual, economic violence. So it's women who can go to court and say, I am being treated with violence by my husband or my partner or my father or my brother. That's the broad framework of this law.
The same as Indian family is not a space for women. It silences women.
So we are very fed up about the women's experiences at home, because we believe that for women in India or elsewhere, the home is a place where she gets security and protection, but that is the first place where our rights are violated.
A women's movement for the first time said that this violence is not a matter of right, it is a crime. Such kind of incidences were, though experienced, they were not talked about in the name of honor. 3 out of 5 women who are abused in their marital homes, it's a huge percentage. This business of it being a private affair definitely was a big issue and continues to be today. A large percentage, above 95, would not want to take the police route. They did not want to see their husband or the father of their child in jail. And the law 498 didn't really address that, because it was a criminal law and all it did was punishment for the man, but there was no relief for the woman. So that's the way the situation was in the 80s.
There were many things that came into play. One was to use all the international commitments that India had made, CEDAW, Beijing Platform of Action, the Vienna Declaration on Human Rights.
And this is not a phenomenon only for India. I was to underline that. This is a global phenomenon with domestic violence.
And when we are hit by a problem in the country, usually we end up in asking for legislation, because we feel that social legislation gives a long-term relief to an issue.
The law addresses how to get married. It tells you how you need to get married for your marriage to be recognized. It also tells you how to exit a marriage, because it tells you how to get a divorce. It doesn't tell you what happens while the marriage is in existence. The writing was on the wall. I mean, we knew that this was the call of the times, that there needs to be a law addressing the issue of domestic violence.
Actually, it was a very consultative process. Once the draft was done, then everybody in the country, all over actually, they took the draft and then we all gave feedback on the draft.
The Lawyers Collective had tried to contact various organizations, concerned individuals who were working on issues of domestic violence.
This kind of work requires extensive study, extensive research, extensive documentation, and all this does require funding.
This act is an act that is intended to do firefighting, to give immediate relief and immediate protection and put an immediate and quick end to very specific acts of physical or emotional violence.
It's a single window, where the woman gets, what are the kinds of redressals that she gets. When the woman said, my husband beats me, please restrain my husband from beating me. That our police would not take cognizance of and our magistrates would not pass. We managed to put this as the protection order.
Protection officers were supposed to be people who were appointed, like say the grievance booth where a woman came and said that this is my problem, and then they were supposed to write a report and send it to the court.
Guidelines put in as to who they can be to address these issues, like what are their qualifications, what kind of backgrounds should they be from, and so on and so forth.
The most critical part about this law, which is the right to residence. The woman actually has no home. In her father's home and mother's home, she's always called Parai. And then when she goes to her husband's home, if something goes wrong, she can be thrown out. It's such a high risk life. This happens for the first time. The notion of a shared household. What a big recognition to what women do.
Shakila needed was a bridge to cross over from violent relationship to a non-violent relationship, and that bridge was provided by the law.
जैसे मैं गांव चली गई, गांव में मैं के चली गई, तो इसने चुरा के शादी मेरे से करा, जो दूसरी करा है मुझे नहीं पता चली। तो जब मैं आई तो ये बस वही पीटना मारना, जाओ मैं तुझे नहीं रखूँगा, मेरे घर मत आओ, बस ये कारनामा। फिर मैं ज़बरदस्ती आती तो मेरा सामान फमान फेंक दे के भगा देता, यही काम था इसका।
In the initial years, there were lots of problems about relative does not include a woman. So you could not bring in as a respondent, you could not have the mother-in-law.
Yeah, he had a mother who was very unsupportive, to say the least. In fact, she incited the violence a lot of times.
In our law, in our criminal law on rape, marital violence does not exist. Sexual violence as an offense comes in.
Priya's at least found the strength to talk about the sexual violence that exists within the marriage. It is assumed that when you marry, you give your consent to have sex with your husband forever and ever and ever and ever, as and when he demands it. And this is why we wanted to introduce sexual violence as a form of domestic violence.
ज़्यादा करके नाइट में ही झगड़े होते हैं, वो उनमें भी वो बिल्कुल अलग तरह के इंसान हैं। उन्हें ऐसा लगता था कि जैसे अब ये मैं इसे ले आया, मैं इसे खरीद के ले आया, मैं जैसे बोलूँ वो वैसे ही सारा कुछ करे, मेरी सारी बातों को वैसे ही सुने। पहली बार जब मुझे मारा तो मुझे बहुत गुस्सा आया। मैं उस कमरे मैंने कुछ सुसाइड करने की भी कोशिश की, पर वो संभव नहीं हुआ।
I think Priya's case is important because it shows you the role of the law in a case in which a woman doesn't want to exit the relationship, and yet she wants a more equal relationship. That's where the law has a role to play for her, to help her achieve her goals. Now, I don't think that's, personally speaking, I don't think that's good enough, because when we say zero tolerance of violence, we mean zero tolerance of violence.
Putting the onus on the government to provide a mechanism, knowing that the woman cannot go alone, just can't run and go alone to the court.
Women needed a one-stop kind of a shop. One law under which you could ask for maintenance, you could ask for custody, you could ask for compensation, you could ask for protection order. The main thing, stop the violence.
So in the beginning, we were learning as well as contributing to the formation of the act.
A law is never written on a blank sheet of paper. It only builds on real life experiences. And the women's movement for many years had been doing what we call casework, which means many women's organizations had set up centers. That rich experience existed on the ground. If you see their casework, you'll find the empirical data that is required to draft a law of this kind. And I would say that was the major contribution of the women's movement. First time we had to approach the NDA government, where Arun Jaitley was the law minister. And we, of course, succeeded in convincing him that we do need a law. But the kind of law that he put on the table, it did have a very negative clause which gave to the perpetrator the right of self-defense. It was unanimously rejected by the women's movement. Then, of course, came the UPA government. At that time, it was the late Arjun Singh who was the Minister for Human Resources, and this was within his nodal ministry. There were certain organizations, particularly people like Moini Giri and the Guild of Service, which did succeed in convincing the UPA to put in their manifesto the issue of domestic violence. They did come to power. And that's when the women's groups were able to mobilize and demand that the UPA redeems its promise.
So there was a lot of, like these meetings that you had to constantly attend, and you had to be on your feet the entire year because you were suddenly called to go and brief this one or that one.
Ashmita and I were sitting in the public gallery of the Lok Sabha when the law was introduced and debated.
But it was very exciting, and we went there, and what was amazing is that complete consensus on the bill.
बीजिंग में जब महिला अधिकारों के ऊपर बातचीत हुई, उसमें कुछ अकॉर्ड भी हुआ था, डिक्लेरेशन हुआ था, और अलग अलग प्रकार से महिलाओं के अधिकार सुरक्षित रखने के लिए उसमें एक कमेटी भी बनी थी। उस समय हम सीडॉ के हम भी सदस्य हैं, जिसमें वो जो कन्वेंशन है जिसमें महिलाओं के लिए एलिमिनेशन ऑफ ऑल सॉर्ट्स ऑफ डिस्क्रिमिनेशन अगेंस्ट वुमेन, और उसके अंतर्गत ये तब से तय था एक प्रकार से कि ऐसा एक कानून लाया जाए, बनाया जाए, जिसमें महिलाओं के ऊपर जो घरेलू हिंसा होती है उसका कहीं ना कहीं सिविल लॉ से उसका हम सॉल्यूशन निकाल सके।
This bill is introduced after very prolonged and persistent efforts by various women organizations in this country. Actually, I should record my thanks to the All India Democratic Women Association and the Lawyers Collective for Women Rights, who had been doing extensive work on this for years.
सर, मैं अनुरोध करती हूँ कि बिल को पास किया जाए.
Thank you. The question is that the bill be passed. Those in favor may please say aye. Aye. Those against may please say no. I think that the ayes have it, the ayes have it, the ayes have it. The motion is adopted and the bill is passed.
There was just one note of dissent from the BJP representatives about the relationships and the nature of marriage. And the response was, this is not just about morality, it's about all those men who abandon their first wives and marry again. And those women have no legal protection at all.
In 2006 October, it finally got implemented. So even though the day was very exciting, we still had to wait for a long time to use the law.
So it was for the first time in our country that we were having a law that provided a meaningful and substantive legislative expression of the idea of violence.
The law that we finally came up with incorporated many of the suggestions made by women's groups all across the country. So the draft was on the table. That's what made the passage of the law easier.
But when she found out about the new law, she decided to fight back. Her husband has now been summoned to appear in court on Monday.
She wants monetary reliefs and maintenance for herself and her children is what she mainly wants, in addition to the protection that she'll never be beaten up again.
He is the man on whom the axe has fallen first under the new Domestic Violence Act.
The domestic violence law was only implemented in 2006. Probably had I had the law at that point in time, my life would have been a little more different. I would have been a stronger person living over there and knowing my rights.
Rashmi turned her grief into something very positive, and she now counsels other women at the Crime Against Women cell.
A lot of women have been coming forward with their problems, which they earlier didn't because they didn't want to go to the police station to complain against their husbands or their father. Now, we're getting women within 2 weeks of marriage, 1 month of marriage, 1 year of marriage, which was unheard of when we began our work. There was a lot of awareness created, but the implementation didn't match the level of awareness.
In most states, they just, handed over to existing personnel. They gave additional charge of PO. So it was ridiculous.
And the law has a lot of portions which require money. If you have protection officers, you have to pay them. We have service providers who are helping, you have to support their work. Shelter homes have to be paid, legal services have to be paid. So it was like a whole bunch of services that you had promised in the Act, but you had not provided for.
We feel that there should be a campaign on allocating budget for effective implementation of the law should be done.
There was a High Court judge in Karnataka who said, if the husband keeps you well, so what if he beats you? As long as he keeps you well. So you have to engage with this kind of ideology.
Passing of this kind of comments should not be allowed. In a sense that I would say there is a dereliction of duty in order to keep our constitution in order.
Judges of the Supreme Court who have said in the case of Batra versus Batra that a woman only has the right to reside in a shared household provided it is owned by her husband. They did it understanding that they were going against the letter and the spirit of the law.
The judges, both men and women, come from our society, they don't come from us, and so many of them are socialized into accepting to some level the legitimacy of violence against women.
That last mile is about delivering entitlements to the doorstep of the woman concerned. And that's when the idea of monitoring and evaluation was born. It is that last mile where you try and deliver what the law promises to the person to whom the promise is made. And the person to whom the promise is made is the woman who is facing domestic violence. And the only way in which that can be done is by monitoring and by evaluating the law. You make sure that systems which are meant to be put in place are put in place. You make sure that judges work the way they're meant to work, and then you evaluate their functioning.
For a police officer or for the stakeholders, the protection officers, the service providers, I haven't seen regular training. There should be points for a domestic violence case like it were an entire case. Because even if it has to be disposed of speedily, there is a lot of intense work that goes into disposing it of speedily.
Women have to be informed. Women have to have a knowledge. I believe that if they have the knowledge, that gives them power.
So what we do is we host an annual conference towards the end of the year. At this conference, we invite obviously UN Women, because they are the people to whom I would give credit for having supported this activity. Then we invite high-ranking officials from Government of India, also making an effort to invite some outstanding personalities who can show the way forward. We would obviously like the press to be present there so that the findings are out there in the public domain. It's holding a mirror up to the law, holding a mirror up to the judges, holding a mirror up to society to say, is this law really functioning? Or was this law passed only for the purpose of scoring a political point? Monitoring and evaluation has to be an ongoing process, and it's not new. It's been done by everybody. Today, the Government of India has a policy of monitoring and evaluating the functioning of its own ministries. The United Nations requires monitoring and evaluation of the performance of governments, accountable in international forums. So basically, monitoring and evaluation is a tool of accountability, and we've done it now for 5 years. This November will be the 6th year, but I'm hoping that in future the government will be monitoring and evaluating this law.
But what I really appreciate with Lawyers Collective is what they have done to convince the government of going further on and take over some of the modalities or tools or programs they have run during this period. They have got funds from the trust fund. I want to give an example of a man who has started a campaign. It is the General Secretary Ban Ki-moon who is our leader for the UN system. He has launched Unite. That means come, women and men together and work even harder than we have done before to reduce violence against women.
If we want to have an ideal society and an ideal relationship, then both have to respect each other and, work in that way.
Gandhi once said, equality is the master key of a non-violent society. And so he recognized that you really cannot build a non-violent society without equality. And we have a deeply unequal society.
For me personally, this whole journey has been a journey to restore the dignity of women to its proper place. We need to see acceptance of non-violence against women in the larger Indian society, and that battle is not yet complete.